3 riders came up the mountain before the light was good enough to name them. Not from Cold River, not from any direction an honest man would choose at that hour. Their horses moved too well, their pace was too deliberate, and the way they spread across the switchback road as they climbed said everything about what kind of conversation they intended to have. On the porch above, a man the size of a doorframe stood without moving. He had not reached for the axe beside the chopping block. He did not need to. Inside the house, a woman was already moving. She did not run. She did not call out. She simply crossed the room, placed something in the low cabinet with both hands, and walked out the front door into the cold March air. She stood beside him, 3 against 2. The lead rider looked up and stopped. 3 riders came up the mountain before the light was good enough to name them. Not from Cold River, not from any direction an honest man would choose at that hour. Their horses moved too well for working animals, too deliberate for men out on ordinary business. And the way they fanned across the switchback road as they climbed said everything that needed saying about what kind of conversation they intended to have. Not riding together the way neighbors ride. Spreading. Taking up the width of the track the way men do when they have been told to leave nowhere to run. On the porch above, Gideon Rowe stood in his canvas duster and did not move. He had not reached for the axe beside the chopping block. He did not need to. He was 6 feet and 8 inches of Wyoming mountain in a world that had agreed on 6'2" as the upper limit of what a man was supposed to be, and the simple fact of him standing still on that porch in the early March gray was already doing more work than the axe would have. Inside the house, Ada was already moving. She did not run. She did not call out. She crossed to the side table in the consulting room, placed the wooden instrument case in the low cabinet with both hands, and a quiet click of the latch, and then she came out the front door into the cold morning air, with her wool coat already buttoned and her chin level, and her eyes on the riders coming up through the pines. She stood beside him, 3 against 2, except the 2 had been through a winter together that had burned everything unnecessary down to the bone. And what was left standing was not the kind of thing that moved easily. The lead rider looked up at the porch and stopped, and that was where it started, though it did not start there. It started 6 months earlier on a wet platform in October rain, with a woman who did not flinch. Cold River, Wyoming had 312 residents by the last county count, and every single one of them had an opinion about Gideon Rowe. Not one of those opinions was neutral. The town had 17 businesses. A church with a tin roof that sang when it rained, 1 hotel that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wool carpet, and 1 dining room worth eating in. It had the Laramie Range above it, and the creek below it, and the long bare basin spreading south, and it had Gideon Rowe up on Stone Ridge looking down at all of it. From it he had silt himself over 3 winters because nothing the world offered had been built to his scale. 6 feet and 8 inches. Shoulders wide enough that he had to angle through doorways that other men walked through without thinking. Hands that could close around a fence post and leave impressions in the wood without trying. He had weighed 260 pounds at the age of 23, and had not changed much since, because the work of running 2,400 acres of Wyoming grassland and granite did not leave a man much opportunity to go soft. Women crossed to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Not because he had given them a single reason, because the animal part of the brain that lives below reason made its calculation before the reasoning part could catch up. Too large, too much, give ground. The animal part was very fast and very consistent, and in 30 years it had never once decided differently. Gideon had made a kind of accommodation with this, the way a man makes accommodation with a bad knee or a lame horse, which is to say he had not made peace with it at all, but had learned to walk so the limp did not show. The morning of October the 3rd, 1884 was raining, not the hard-driving rain that came off the Laramie Peaks in July and meant serious business. The cold, gray October rain that did not seem to intend harm so much as despair. It came down steady and quiet and turned the wagon ruts into dark rivers and made the platform at the Cold River depot smell of wet iron and old wood and the loneliness of places where people are always arriving or leaving and never quite staying. Gideon stood under the depot's narrow overhang with his hat in both hands and water running off the brim in thin streams. He wore the good canvas shirt, dark brown, shoulders reinforced, ordered from the catalog 3 years ago, and saved for occasions that required something better than work clothes. He wore his heavy canvas trousers, the wide belt with the brass buckle his father had left him, his tall lace-up boots that had worn over 5 years into the exact shape of his feet. He had combed his dark beard that morning. He had combed his hair. He was a man who was trying, and trying in this particular way, with this particular history behind it, was the saddest version of trying because it was the kind that had learned not to expect anything, and tried anyway. He did not want to be there. Every part of him wanted to be on the back of his horse, heading back up the mountain road to the house where the silence was familiar, and the furniture was the right size. He had sent good silver to the agency in Denver for this arrangement. Silver he could spare, but had chosen not to spare, because somewhere under 30 years of learned indifference, there was still the part of him his mother had raised. The part that believed a man did not leave a stranger standing alone on a wet platform in an unfamiliar town. He had stood on this platform 7 times before. Each time he had told himself it was the last. Each time the train had come around the bend and his chest had done the thing he hated, that stupid lurching thing like a young horse that has not yet learned what the branding iron teaches. Each time he had pressed his hat back onto his head and stepped forward into whatever the train had brought and held his face very carefully and felt the hope go out like a lamp in wind. He was very good now at managing his face. He had identified which muscles to hold still and which ones he could allow their ordinary work, and the result was an expression that the people of Cold River described as unreadable. He thought of it simply as controlled. He controlled it now. The morning freight came around the long eastern curve with its whistle and its white breath and its ordinary cargo of people going about their ordinary lives. The passengers came down from the cars in the usual order. A whiskey drummer in a checked vest with sample cases in each hand. 2 ranch hands in flannel shirts and canvas trousers worn thin at the knee, who had the look of men who had been riding for a week and smelled accordingly. An older woman in a black wool coat being met by a younger man who kissed her cheek and took her bag. And then she stepped down. He had stopped knowing what to prepare himself for after the 3rd failure, which meant he had been preparing himself for something generic, something frightened and young which was unfair, and he knew it, and he did it anyway because it was the only armor available. She was not what the armor had been made for. Small. The kind of small that registered first as information before it became description. The way you register a change in elevation, or a drop in temperature before you have put a name to it. The top of her head under a dark blue traveling bonnet would not have reached his collarbone. She was not young in the way the agency's letters implied the previous women would be. There was silver threaded through the brown hair at her temples, and fine lines at the corners of her eyes. The kind that only accumulate through sustained encounters with difficulty over many years. She carried a single worn carpet bag and a wooden case with a brass clasp. He recognized the case before she had taken 3 steps on the platform. A physician's instrument case. He had seen one like it 2 winters back when the doctor came up to the ridge to set a hired man's badly broken leg. She held both items against her body in the practiced way of someone who had learned not to put things down in unfamiliar places, not even for a moment. She stood on the wet platform and looked at the town first. Took it in with the brief systematic efficiency of someone who reads environments the way other people read text. Then she looked down the platform. Then she looked at him. Gideon Rowe had spent 30 years waiting for the flinch. He knew its exact shape. He could feel it coming the way you feel a change in weather, that drop in pressure before the storm arrives. The eyes widening, the chin pulling back, the whole body performing that small involuntary subtraction, removing itself from proximity it had accidentally wandered into. He had seen it in men and women both, in horses and in children. He understood it for what it was, which was not cruelty, but simply the animal nervous system doing its job, making space between itself and something that did not fit the normal categories. He waited for it. She looked at him. She took the full climb from his boot tops to his hat brim, and she took her time about it. And something moved across her face that stopped every word he had assembled for the usual moment of kind dismissal. It was not fear. It was relief. The specific relief of someone who has been looking for something in a place where they did not entirely expect to find it, and has just found it. She set the carpet bag down on the wet platform boards, and picked her way toward him through the slick planks with the careful footing of someone who had decided not to fall, and intended to keep that decision. She stopped at a distance that was respectful rather than afraid and looked up at him. You'd be Rowe. Not a question, Her voice carried without effort, the voice of a woman accustomed to being heard in rooms where people were in pain and needed instruction. I would. His voice came out the way it always did, the low rumble that had made grown men step back from card tables and bar counters, and he watched her face for what it always produced. There was nothing, and you'd be Voss. She put out her right hand. Small, chapped at the knuckles. Steady as a fence post set in frozen ground. He looked at it the way a starving man looks at bread he has been wrong about before. Then he folded his enormous fingers around hers, and her hand disappeared entirely, wrist and all. And she did not pull back, and she did not tighten, and she did not do anything except shake his hand with the same matter-of-fact firmness she would have extended to anyone. I expect you've been told things about me. The old reflex. Get ahead of it. Name it before it names you. I heard them. Her expression did not change, but something in it shifted, something dry and precise. From the men at the last water stop and the driver of the eastbound stage last week, and a woman on this train who felt it was her Christian duty to warn me. The smallest pause. I heard everything there is to hear about the devil of Stone Ridge. The old shame came up in him like heat rising through stone. He released her hand. Then you know why the others left. She looked at him for a moment in the rain. This small woman with her silver-threaded hair and her physician's case, and her expression that gave away nothing except the quality of attention behind it. I know the reason they gave, she said. But I know a different thing too. She picked up the carpet bag. You're standing in the rain waiting for me. That tells me something the other story doesn't. For a moment, Gideon Rowe, who had spent 30 years learning to expect nothing, could not locate a single word in the English language. Then he reached down and took the carpet bag from her hand. There's a dining room on the next block that does decent coffee, he said. If you're cold, she settled the instrument case against her hip. I'm cold, she said, and that was how it started. Briggs's Diner occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Cold River's Main Street. The kind of establishment that made no promises about elegance and kept everyone it made about warmth. The floor was uneven planking. The ceiling was low enough that Gideon had to angle his head to clear the exposed beam that ran the length of the room. The smells was wood smoke and cooking grease, and the wet wool of people who had been out in the rain, which on a cold October morning was nearly everyone. 4 small tables with mismatched chairs, a long counter where 2 men sat with the determined silence of men who drink their coffee like a job. Both of those men found their cups extremely interesting when Gideon ducked through the door. He was used to it. The room going quiet when he entered, the way ordinary conversations lost their thread, and people's eyes went anywhere but to him, with the haste of people who did not want to be caught looking. He took the table in the back corner. Less navigation around him, less chance of someone brushing against the sheer physical reality of him and losing their composure. He sat with his back to the wall because that was a frontier habit that had never stopped being practical. Ada sat across from him, which put the top of her head at approximately the level of his chest even seated. She wrapped both hands around the tin coffee cup when it arrived, and looked at the room with the same brief appraisal she had given the platform. And then she looked at him. They're afraid of you. Not an accusation, not sympathy, a diagnosis, delivered with the clinical neutrality of someone identifying a condition rather than assigning blame. Something shifted in Gideon's chest. They don't mean anything by it. He stopped, reconsidered. Mostly it's easier not to correct it, he said, because correcting it requires them to admit they were wrong to begin with, and that's uncomfortable. So they keep the story, and you let them keep it. She drank her coffee. You've been doing that long enough, it's become a habit. She set the cup down. I'm observant, professional requirement, a pause. I'm also told it can be irritating. The sound that came out of him then surprised him. Rough and unpracticed, like a pump that has not been used in a season. A laugh. He pressed his hand to his mouth after the fact, as if he could put it back, and Ada watched him do it, with an expression he could not quite read, because no one had ever looked at him with that particular combination of things before. That was when May Briggs came out from behind her counter. May Briggs was approximately 68 years old, and had run this dining room for 31 years and was in possession of a face that life had worked over thoroughly, and a voice that carried the specific authority of a woman who has never in her adult life needed to raise it to be heard. She wore a heavy leather apron over a white cotton shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she moved through her dining room with the proprietary efficiency of a woman who owned every square foot she occupied. She planted herself at the end of their table and looked Ada over from bonnet to boot, with absolutely no attempt at social grace. So this is her. A chin jerk toward Gideon, the new one. A brief assessment. You've got more sense in your face than the last 6 put together. She turned back without waiting. He's the gentlest soul on this mountain. The fools in this valley have been too busy fearing his shadow to see the man inside it. You look like someone with the sense to see different. I hope you are. Because this one has been alone long enough it's starting to look permanent, and that is a waste this valley cannot afford. She went back to a counter muttering something under her breath that contained the words whiskey and senseless, as though they were 2 halves of the same problem. Ada watched her go. I like her. Everyone likes May. Gideon found he was watching Ada's face instead of the room, which was not something he had done with anyone in longer than he could calculate. It is the single point of consensus in Cold River. Ada set her cup down with the quiet deliberateness he had already begun to recognize as something she did when she was about to say something she had been holding in reserve. Mr. Rowe, she said, I'd like to tell you something before you make up your mind about anything, and I would be grateful if you let me finish before you respond. He said he would. She told him about Henry Vale first, her first husband, a physician in a Wyoming territory town who had taught her everything he knew because he had no sons and she had steady hands and was not afraid of blood or the sounds a man made when a bone was being set. 11 years working beside him, she doing procedures he trusted to no other hands, he making diagnoses she had come to understand as thoroughly as he did. When he died of cholera, in the summer of 1878, she had continued working because the patient still needed someone and there was no one else. She told him about Preston Dole, her second husband. She said the name with a flatness that told him more than embellishment would have. A man who had come with the appearance of a gentleman and the stated intention of providing for her, and who had proved to hold an entirely different understanding of what providing meant. He had spent her savings. When the savings were gone, he had found other things. She did not specify what those other things were. And Gideon did not ask because he had lived long enough and known enough people to understand that the flatness in her voice was not the absence of feeling, but the result of having decided, at some specific point, that the feeling was not going to be useful. Preston Dole had died in a riding accident on a frozen road in January of 1882. When the estate was settled, it had been empty. His brother, Silas Drummond, a man with political connections and land holdings across Wyoming territory, had decided that the debts his brother left were family debts, which meant debts belonging to Preston's widow. The law was not precisely on his side. Silas Drummond had not required the law to be precisely on his side in other matters, and did not intend to start now. Ada had left in March of 1884. She had taken her physician's instruments, her medical notebooks, and the complete documentation she had requested directly from the financial institutions holding Preston's accounts before the estate closed. Every signature on every document was Preston Dole's, not hers. During this account, Gideon did not move. The hand he had resting on the table made a slow, involuntary fist as she spoke about Preston Dole, the fingers curling in toward the palm with the specific tension of a man controlling something that would otherwise not stay controlled. And then with a visible and deliberate effort he opened it again, and kept it flat on the scarred table. He was looking at the wood grain rather than her face, not from indifference. From the specific difficulty of having a face he was not certain he could manage if he kept watching hers. I'm not telling you this for your sympathy, Ada said. Her voice was level. I'm telling you because I want nothing false between us. Not even the polite kind. She picked up her coffee. I came here because someone told me there was a man in Wyoming that the whole world was afraid of who had not in all his years harmed a living soul. I thought, there is something I have never seen. A man with every possible reason and every possible means to be cruel who simply chooses not to be. Her gray eyes were on him now. Direct, without performance. I needed to know if that man was real. Gideon made himself look up. I've been here 17 minutes, Ada said. I think he might be. He was not, Gideon thought later, a man who cried. He had not cried since the week after his mother died when he was 14, and the house had been too quiet and too small for his grief. And he had gone out to the north pasture in the dark, and stood there until the cold made thinking impossible. He was not a man who cried, but something in his chest in that moment in Briggs's diner, with the rain coming down outside, and the 2 men at the counter minding their own business with great concentration. Something in his chest did a thing that had no other name for it. The offer she put to him was simple and had clearly been thought through before she arrived. A room of her own with a lock she controlled. His honest word that he would not put his hands on her except at her invitation. Permission to practice medicine in the valley, where the nearest trained physician was a day and a half south by hard riding, and the people made do with what they had, and an honest winter. Not a performance of domesticity, not an audition, not a trial that either party was pretending was not a trial. An honest winter to see what two people the world had decided were not worth keeping might build together if they were not required to pretend to be something they were not. That is my offer, she said. You are free to refuse it. Gideon Rowe looked at this small, unafraid woman across the scarred table in the only warm room in Cold River, and felt the door of the great locked room in his chest move on hinges that had not moved in a decade. I accept, he said. The road up to Stone Ridge took an hour and a quarter by wagon in good weather and more in rain. A winding track through ponderosa pine and granite outcroppings that went up in switchbacks and occasionally offered a view of the valley below through gaps in the trees. Gideon drove. Ada sat beside him on the wagon seat in her wool coat with the carpet bag at her feet and the instrument case on her lap, and did not appear to find the silence uncomfortable. That itself was unusual. Most people found silence with Gideon Rowe uncomfortable. They filled it with words the way they might fill a dark room with lamplight, quickly, because the alternative required sitting with their own uncertainty about him. Ada looked at the landscape. She looked at it with genuine attention, the way she had looked at the platform and the dining room, and his face, as if she were building an accurate record of the place in case she needed to refer to it later. Once she pointed to a granite formation above the tree line on the eastern ridge, 2 columns the local people called the pulpits, and asked what they were called. He told her. She nodded. She did not fill the silence after that with additional remarks about the formation or the weather or the journey. He appreciated this more than he knew how to say and did not try. The house, when it came into view around the last switchback, was the house of a man who had decided that if the world was not going to make space for him, he would make his own. High roofline, broad porch with a ceiling tall enough that he could stand on it in his hat, windows larger than standard because he needed the light. The logs were peeled and fitted close, the kind of work that cares about doing it right, and the wood had weathered to a silver gray that on a gray October day made the house look as though it had grown from the ridge rather than been built on it. Ada was quiet for a moment when she first saw it. You built this over 3 winters. She looked at it with the appraiser's eye she brought to everything. You built it to fit you. There wasn't anything else that did. She noticed everything. The high ceilings, the proportioned door frames, the furniture that was plainly homemade and built to a scale no catalog offered. She noticed the shelves of small carved animals with an expression that stopped her in the middle of the room. She picked up a small carved bird from the nearest shelf, a cedar waxwing, each feather worked in individual detail, and held it in both palms and looked at it with the careful attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. You made these. Something to do with my hands. He looked away. It is not worth remarking on. She set the cedar waxwing on the windowsill of the room he showed her at the end of the hall, the room he had prepared that morning in the dark hours before dawn, moving through it by lamplight with the careful, embarrassed hope of a man who has learned not to show hope, but has not managed to stop having it. Clean quilt, fresh water in the pitcher, the lamp trimmed and ready, dried wildflowers in a blue glass bottle he had found in the back of the storage shed and had never previously had a reason to use, yellow and purple, the last of the season. He showed her the lock. He had fitted it the morning before, a sturdy iron bolt on the inside of the door, the kind that required deliberate engagement from within. He told her about it with his eyes on the floor rather than her face, because this was the part he found most difficult to say and most necessary to say. That the bolt was there so his word would not require her trust before she had reason to extend it, so she would have proof in her own hand, something she could feel and hear click into place, something that did not ask her to believe anything about him, before she had come to it herself. When he made himself look up, there was something in her face that had not been there before. Something bright and unguarded, there and then controlled, like a lamp catching briefly in wind before the glass is fitted back around it. Thank you, Gideon, she said, his name, his given name, in her voice, ordinary as breathing. He carried the sound of it in his chest for the rest of the afternoon like something he was being careful not to drop. That evening he slept in the barn. He told himself it was because the roan mare in the near stall was close to foaling, and he liked to be present when that happened. This was true. The other true thing, the one he did not say aloud to anyone including himself until much later, was that he did not trust his own stillness well enough to sleep under the same roof as her yet, that the enormousness of wanting to be nothing alarming, nothing too large, nothing like the thing they called him, required more distance than 12 feet of hallway could provide. He lay in the clean straw with the rain tapping the barn roof in its slow evening rhythm, and looked up at the dark rafters. For the first time in 9 years he did not fall asleep with the particular quality of silence that is not peace, but the absence of hope. This silence was different. Somewhere in the house across the yard, Ada Voss, physician and widow, woman who had not flinched, was sleeping in a room with a lock she controlled. And the difference between that silence and the silence of every previous night was so large that he lay awake for a long time holding it carefully, not sure yet what to do with it, only sure that it needed to be held. In Cold River, in the Silver Star Hotel on the main street, a lean man in a worn brown vest had been making quiet inquiries since mid-afternoon. His name was Cole Fitch. He worked for Silas Drummond the way some men work, for men with money and long reach, which is to say invisibly and without scruple, and in the specific understanding that his usefulness depended entirely on never being memorable. He had a knack for conversations that yielded information without appearing to seek it, for questions shaped like statements, for the comfortable manner of a man who had been everywhere and was curious about nothing in particular. He had been on the same train as Ada Voss. He had watched her step off at Cold River. He had observed the man on the depot platform, noted the absence of the flinch that everyone in Drummond's Cheyenne office had told him was inevitable when a woman first laid eyes on Gideon Rowe, and had felt a small professional irritation at the complication this represented. The woman had not performed the expected response. The man on the platform had not performed the expected response either. They had shaken hands in the rain like people who had arranged to meet for legitimate reasons, which of course they had, but the absence of fear on her part, and the absence of the usual grotesque spectacle on his, suggested the situation was not going to resolve itself as quickly or as neatly as Drummond's office had assumed. In his room at the Silver Star, by the light of the single lamp the hotel considered adequate, Fitch composed a telegram to an address in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Brief and professional. Ada Voss, formerly of Western Wyoming, had arrived in Cold River and appeared to be taking up residence on the ridge property of one Gideon Rowe. He awaited further instructions. He blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and thought that the woman had chosen an unusual sanctuary. He thought about the size of the man he had seen on that platform, about the absence of the expected reaction, and about the fact that money and paper were patient things that did not get cold or tired or lonely, and were entirely indifferent to how large a man was, or how gently he chose to move through a world that had given him every reason to move differently. He would wait. Outside, the cleared sky over Cold River was full of Wyoming stars, indifferent and ancient and brilliant, and on the ridge above the valley, the lights in the house called Stone Ridge went dark one by one until only the barn window was still lit, a single small square of yellow in the black mountain, where a man lay awake in clean straw and listened to the roan mare shift in her stall and tried, for the first time in years, not to prepare himself for losing. The morning after her arrival, Ada was in the kitchen before he came in from the barn. She had found the coffee and the hand grinder. She had found the linseed oil and the cleaning cloth in the storage room off the kitchen, and she had laid out his carving tools on the cloth on the work table. The dozen small-handled knives and gouges and chisels he had left rusting in the corner for the better part of a year, and she had cleaned every one of them, and was finishing the last gouge when he stopped in the doorway, with barn straw still on his canvas coat. He looked at the tools arranged in their proper order on the cloth. He looked at her. "Good tools rust when they're neglected," she said, not looking up. She set the last gouge down with precision. "That seems like a shame. You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked up at him then, and there was nothing in her face that asked for credit or expected gratitude. Just the clear, simple expression of a person who had seen something that needed doing and had done it. "There's coffee." He took the cup she poured and stood at the kitchen window, drinking it. looking out at the gray morning and the wet pine trees and the view down the valley to where Cold River sat invisible in the low cloud, and he thought, with a specific and deliberate effort, that he would not let himself hope. And then he hoped anyway, because apparently that particular lesson had not yet finished teaching itself. The first patient came 4 days after Ada arrived. Word had traveled faster than he would have credited, which said something about how badly the valley needed what she had brought up the mountain. Seth Dunbar was 24 years old, a ranch hand from the Kemper spread 5 miles south, and he had taken a 6-inch nail through the palm of his right hand 4 days ago in a fencing accident that had been ignored in the optimistic way that ranch hands ignored injuries when seeing a physician meant 2 days out of the saddle. His older brother Frank brought him up the switchbacks on a gray morning, with his hand wrapped in cloth that had been soaked through twice. Ada looked at the hand for approximately 3 seconds. "Get me boiling water and clean cloth." The voice she used when speed mattered, not a request, a statement of what would happen next, and Gideon had the water heating before the sentence was finished, because it was the voice of someone who knew exactly what the situation required. And he recognized that kind of authority the way you recognize certain truths, not from instruction, but from something deeper than that. She worked for 40 minutes. Quiet in the way that concentration is quiet rather than solemnity. Her hands moved with the economy of someone for whom these steps were no longer decisions but a sequence, each one flowing from the last without deliberation. She had Seth's hand cleaned and drained and dressed with something from her case, and properly splinted with a piece of ash Gideon had split to her specified thickness, and she had Frank Dunbar holding written instructions and a packet of dried medicinal herbs before he had entirely accepted that his brother was going to keep the hand. Frank held those instructions in both his big rancher's hands and looked at them, and looked at Ada and said, in the rough, quiet voice of a man unaccustomed to this kind of thing, "My brother needs that hand to work, Dr. Voss. I expect you just saved it." Then he looked at Gideon. Not the way people usually looked at Gideon. The usual look had been honed by years into something automatic, a wariness that occupied the space between them, before either party had done anything to deserve it. This look was different, a man looking at another man and revising something, adjusting a long-held assumption about what kind of thing he was standing next to. It lasted only a moment. Frank took his brother's arm and helped him to the horses, and they rode back down the mountain, and the morning went on. Gideon stood in the yard after they were gone, and Ada came to stand beside him, drying her hands on clean cloth. "The nail had been in there 4 days," she said. "He'll keep the hand if he follows the instructions. Will he follow them?" She considered this with the same careful attention she brought to everything. The brother will make him. She folded the cloth with precision. "I asked Frank 3 questions while I was working. He's the one who manages his younger brother's decisions. You learn to read which person in the room is actually responsible for the outcome." He watched her walk back toward the house, and he thought about the way she had said which person in the room, and about the assumption that rooms always contained such a person, and about how naturally that assumption sat on her, as natural as the wool coat and the practical ankle boots and the instrument case with its brass clasp. He went back to the fence he had been mending on the east side, and worked harder than usual that afternoon, because this was what he did sometimes when he needed to think, when the physical demand of the work gave the thinking part of his mind enough stillness to function. He mended 300 yards of fence and thought about Ada Voss, who had come up his mountain with a case of instruments and a deal, and an expression of relief on the train platform, who had cleaned his rusting tools before she had been here 24 hours, and had not asked him to thank her for it, who had read which person in the room held the actual authority and had aimed her 3 questions accordingly. 7 women had come to this ridge. He had given each of them this same house, this same porch, this same view down the valley. Not one of them had made it to the first snow. Something always broke before then, some seam in the arrangement that the reality of him split open, and they went back down the mountain road. He did not know, driving a fence staple with a force that would have gone an inch into solid oak, whether Ada Voss was different in any way that would prove lasting. He did not know whether the steadiness in her was the kind that held, or the kind that was still being tested and had not yet found its limit. What he knew was that she had cleaned his carving tools, and told him it was a shame to let good tools rust. He drove the staple home and moved to the next post. In Cold River that afternoon, while Gideon mended fence and Ada organized the small storage room off the kitchen into something that would serve as a consulting room. Cole Fitch was making his second round of quiet inquiries at the Silver Star Bar. By the time he finished his second glass of the hotel's indifferent rye, he knew that the woman up on Stone Ridge had already treated one patient, that she was working out of Rowe's house, and that May Briggs had publicly characterized Gideon Rowe as the gentlest soul on this mountain, in front of at least 8 witnesses 2 days ago. He telegraphed Cheyenne again. The situation, he reported, appeared stable for now. The woman seemed settled. The man was still the man they had been told about, large and quiet and apparently harmless. He did not yet see a clean path for whatever Silas Drummond required. He would keep watching. The next morning, Ada came downstairs to find the kitchen warm and the coffee made, and Gideon already gone to the upper pasture. On the work table where she had cleaned his tools, she found one of his small carved birds, a meadowlark, the size of her fist, which was saying something given the scale of the hands that had made it, with the pale yellow breast worked in detail that defied the instrument responsible for it. She held it for a moment. Then she put it on the windowsill beside the cedar waxwing from the day before. She did not mention it when he came in at noon. He did not mention it either. But that afternoon, working in the consulting room, she found herself looking at the 2 birds on the windowsill more than once. Not at the valley below through the glass. At the birds. At the evidence, precise and patient and repeated, of a man who had been making beautiful things in solitude for years, because it was the only way he had found to spend what he had inside him. Outside, the sky had cleared to the pale hard blue of a Wyoming October afternoon. The Laramie Range above the ridge was white with the first snow of the season on the peaks. And somewhere beyond it, in Cheyenne, a telegram was sitting on the desk of a man named Silas Drummond, who read it twice and set it down and poured himself a glass of whiskey and looked out at the street below and decided that patient men won things that impatient men lost. He would give it time. The mountain could wait. November came to Stone Ridge the way winter comes to the high country, not gradually, not with warning. All at once, as though the mountain had been waiting for permission and received it overnight. One morning the temperature dropped 40 degrees between dawn and noon. The sky went the color of cold iron. By the time Gideon came in from the north pasture at midday, the first snow was moving sideways off the Laramie peaks, and the road down to Cold River had become a thing you thought carefully about rather than simply traveled. He had been preparing for Wyoming winters alone for 9 years. The process was automatic now. Wood split and stacked deep under the woodshed eave. Root vegetables pulled and cellared. The stock moved into the lower barn with extra bedding against the cold. What the 9 years had not prepared him for was doing any of it within earshot of another person. The sound of Ada in the consulting room while he came and went through the yard. A lamp in her window when he crossed from the barn in the dark. The coffee already made when he came in before dawn, set at his place without ceremony, as though the fact of him needing it in the morning was simply a condition of the house now, like the way the east wall creaked in wind. Ada had been on Stone Ridge 5 weeks when the first real snow came down, and in those 5 weeks she had changed things without appearing to change anything. That was the quality that struck him first, and that he kept returning to in the evenings when he was carving and she was reading, and neither of them was talking. She had not rearranged his life. She had simply inhabited it, and the inhabiting had revealed, by contrast, how empty it had been. Word of the physician on the ridge moved through the valley the way urgent information always moves in places where there is only one channel for it, which is faster than anyone intends. Within the first 2 weeks, Seth Dunbar had gone back down with a hand infection properly addressed, and his brother Frank, telling anyone who would listen about Dr. Voss and the written instructions and the yarrow. A ranch wife with a persistent fever that had defeated 3 different store remedies, improved within a week of Ada's tea regimen and her specific instructions about rest. Pete Garfield, whose chest had rattled through 2 winters without anyone putting a name to it, rode up the switchbacks in the second week of November with his hat in his hands and came down 2 hours later with a diagnosis of pulmonary calcification and a treatment plan and an expression of stunned relief that his wife would later say she had not seen on his face in 7 years. Each of these people had to get past Gideon first, not by design. He was simply present the way large things are present, moving between the barn and the house and the outbuildings on the ordinary business of the ranch. and the sight of him produced the standard recalibration in anyone who had not yet made their peace with his dimensions. He watched it happen and absorbed it the way he had absorbed it for 30 years. What was different now was Ada. She came out of the house when Patience arrived, said his name in the voice she used for ordinary things, unhurried, without emphasis, asking him to bring a horse around or carry something from the storage room. And the effect of this on whoever was standing in the yard was something Gideon could observe without quite accounting for, as if his size required Ada's complete indifference to it before it could become simply a man standing in his own yard. She was not managing the situation. She was not performing comfort for anyone's benefit. She treated him as what he was, a man in his own home, and the radical simplicity of this was entirely invisible to her because she appeared to have no experience of the alternative. He thought about this in the evenings for a long time, before he understood what he was actually thinking about, which was that in 39 years, no one had ever done it before. He was splitting the last of the big rounds near the woodshed on a Wednesday in mid-November when she came out to him, not with a task. She came out in her wool coat with 2 tin cups of coffee and handed him one and stood beside him looking at the view where the low cloud had broken enough to show the basin below and the dark line of the creek and the scattered lights of Cold River 3 miles south. Pete Garfield has a calcification in his left lung. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air, 2 inches. He's had it for years. It explains the rattle. A pause. It's not going to kill him. He needed to know that. Gideon looked at the valley. He thought it would. He was certain of it. 7 years of certainty about dying changes a man, Ada said. Her voice had the quiet of someone thinking aloud, working something out in the open air rather than inside herself. His wife said he stopped making plans, stopped fixing things that needed fixing. What is the point of repairing a fence post when you believe you will not be alive for the next winter that requires it? Another pause, and now he knows the fence post is worth fixing. She looked up at him from beside his elbow, which was approximately her eye level, when they were standing on level ground. I find that is often the most useful thing medicine can do. Not cure, clarify. Tell a person the truth about their situation so they can decide what to do with the time they actually have, instead of spending it in the wrong kind of fear. Gideon set his axe down. You like it, he said, the work. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. I was built for it, she said finally. The way some people are built for a particular thing and cannot explain why they are good at it. Henry taught me the mechanics. But the part that makes someone a physician, rather than simply a person who knows medicine, that part I cannot account for. She finished her coffee. I only know that I have never felt as useless as I felt in the 2 years after Preston died, when there was no one who needed what I have. He held this the way he held a piece of wood before starting to carve it, feeling for the grain, finding what was true in it. You came here because Silas Drummond was looking for you, he said. But that is not the only reason. She looked at him. No, she said, it is not the only reason. She took his empty cup and went back inside. And he stood in the November cold for a while, longer looking at the valley, and thought about the word built and about the things a person could be built for, that the world did not immediately recognize as useful, and about how long it could take before the right situation arrived to prove the purpose. December came. The road to Cold River closed for a week in the first real cold snap and then reopened and then closed again. And by Christmas, the two of them had developed the rhythms of people who have been shut into a space together long enough that the rhythms are no longer decisions. She woke before dawn. He built the fire before she rose because he had learned the specific quality of her sleep in the pre-dawn hours, the way it changed when the cold found the room. Building the fire was easier than explaining why he had built it. She read in the evenings, he carved. Neither of them required the other to talk. He was finishing The Great Horned Owl in mountain mahogany the night she caught him watching her instead of his work. The fire was burning well, and she was reading a novel whose cover was missing, one she never described, and she had her knee drawn up on the settle and her boot heel on the rung, and her hair was down because it was evening and she had unpinned it after supper, and the firelight was doing something to the silver in it that he had been looking at for probably 10 minutes before she turned the page and looked up and found him looking. He went back to the owl. He heard her set the book down. Say it, she said. It is nothing. You have been staring at the fire for the last quarter hour and the fire is not where your eyes were pointed. She waited. Say it. He looked at the grain of the mahogany running in a curve through the breast that he had been working around for 3 evenings. The firelight, he said. In your hair. The silver catches it. He stopped. Then, because stopping halfway was worse than continuing, like frost on a window on a cold, clear morning, when the sun first touches it, and for a moment the whole thing is lit from inside, he shook his head. It is a foolish thing to say. Ada sat very still across the fire from him. When she spoke, her voice had a texture he had not heard in it before. Not the professional steadiness, not the precise clarity. Something underneath those things that had been there all along, and was only now close enough to the surface to be heard. Gideon, she said, in 20 years, no man ever told me I was beautiful and meant it. I had to stop believing the word applied to me in any useful way. She looked at him across the warmth between them. You go right on saying foolish things like that, as many as you like. For as long as you like. He went back to the owl and did not trust his voice for the rest of the evening. That night he carved her a frost flower from a scrap of white pine, working by lamplight after she had gone to her room, the petals thin as paper. He left it on the windowsill of the consulting room before he went to bed. She did not mention it in the morning. But when he passed her door 3 days later, it was still there beside the cedar waxwing from October, and it stayed there after that in the way that certain things stay. Not because anyone decided they should, but because removing them would require a decision no one intended to make. January brought the worst storm of the season. The ranchers in the valley, who had lived through the hard winters, called it the howler. The storm that found every gap in every wall and filled it with its voice. It came on a Thursday night, and by midnight the drifts against the north wall of the house were level with the lower windowsills, and the wind was working the eaves with the methodical persistence of something that had decided to stay indefinitely. Ada did not sleep. Gideon knew before he heard her. He had learned the sounds of her rest over 3 months. The specific silence of the house when she was genuinely sleeping versus the different quality of it when she was not. And the house had been wrong since before midnight. He got up in the dark and crossed the cold parlor without a lamp, because he knew the room by feel, and because the darkness felt less intrusive than light would have. He went to one knee at the stove and built the fire back from the banked coals, with the patience of a man who has done this 10,000 times. She appeared in the doorway with her wool blanket around her shoulders and her hair loose. She stood looking at him crouched at the stove in the dark and did not appear surprised. He did not speak. He let the fire catch and grow, and when the heat began to push back against the cold, he settled onto the floor, with his back against the stone of the stove housing, and looked at the fire and waited, because this was not a situation that required anything from him except presence. And presence was the one thing he knew with absolute certainty how to give. She sat in the chair nearest the stove. The wind shook the north wall in long concussive gusts. Outside, the storm was working through the pines and across the open ridgeline with the sound of something that has no particular grievance and no particular mercy, and is simply itself. Immense. Indifferent. Inside, the fire burned and the room warmed by degrees. After a long time without speaking, she said, not looking at him, I don't sleep well in storms. I know. She turned her head. How long have you known? Since the 2nd week. He kept his eyes on the fire. You wake at the first change in the wind. You have done it every storm since October. A silence. You've been counting. Paying attention. He looked at her then across the warmth between them. There is a difference. The storm found a loose board somewhere above the east bedroom and set it rattling in a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular, and Ada watched the fire for a while. Then, without announcement, she left the chair and came to sit beside him on the floor, close against his left side, and pulled the blanket around both of them, and put her head on his shoulder, the way a person puts something down that they have been carrying for a long time. He did not move. He understood with perfect clarity what it had cost her to do that, what the history of her life had to have cost for this specific act to be possible. And he held perfectly still, while the storm spent itself against the walls, and the fire burned from orange down through red, and she slept. Not the shallow, unsatisfied sleep of someone going through the motions of rest, but genuine sleep. Deep and slow. The sleep of a person who has found a place safe enough to fully release. He was still there when the gray light came through the frosted window. His back ached from the stone and one leg had gone entirely numb, and he had not moved in 4 hours and had no intention of having moved differently. He looked at the morning coming gray through the glass, and thought about his mother, and about the things she had told him, and about whether it was possible that the reason for a person's particular construction could remain hidden from them for 39 years, and then become entirely clear in a single night on a cold floor in January. The storm cleared by mid-morning. The road to Cold River remained buried for 11 straight days. He had braced for the extended confinement, the potential friction of two people in close quarters for too long with no relief. He had told himself to be patient, to give space, to remember that even a person who seemed comfortable in his company would eventually require room he could not provide in a house this size. He was not prepared for it to feel like enough. More than enough. Like the first time in memory that the winter was not something to be outlasted. She worked through the days. Patient records in the leather notebook, correspondence she wrote carefully at the consulting room desk, and that he did not ask about. The ongoing reorganization of her instrument case that seemed to involve more decision-making than the size of the case suggested was necessary. She had taken over the management of the kitchen supplies with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, not by displacing his system but by understanding it and improving it in ways he noticed only after the improvement had been in place for several days. The spices were arranged differently. He realized after a week that the new arrangement made more sense and said nothing about it. He taught her things no book she owned contained. He knew the high country the way a person knows something they have spent decades reading. Not from study but from accumulated presence, and she was a student who asked questions that were exactly as specific as they needed to be, and no more specific. What the color of the sky above the eastern ridge meant about the next 12 hours. Which way the deer moved before a storm and which way after. The difference between the sound the creek made in a normal freeze, and the sound it made when the ice was building wrong and would need watching. She listened to these things the way she listened to a patient's chest. Full instrument of attention directed at the information rather than at herself. He listened to her too. He followed her voice through the evenings when she read aloud from the medical text, watching the page as she turned so he could see the words, sounding out the difficult ones in the low undervoice he used when he was not certain. She never paused for him, never adjusted her pace. The word was there on the page and in her voice. If he needed to hear it twice, the text continued and he could find it again. The night he read the word pulmonary without stopping. One clean motion. He looked up, and she was already looking at him over the edge of the book, and the expression on her face was not congratulation, and not pride, and not any of the things he had been prepared to deflect. It was the expression of someone watching a person do something they had always been capable of, and are only now being given the opportunity to discover. He went back to the owl without speaking and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a word for. Something quieter than joy and more permanent, something related to being seen but not quite that. It was during the final days of the 11-day closure, with the valley still white to the horizon, and the two of them the only living souls within sight or sound of each other, that the conversation happened that he had known was coming since October. She had set her book down. He had set his work down. The fire was burning well and the wind outside was only wind, nothing like the howler. Just the ordinary late January air moving across the ridge. She was beside him on the long settle with her shoulder against his arm. "There is a thing I have never asked," she said, not looking at him. "I want to ask it now, and I want you to know before I do, that your answer does not change what I have already decided." He knew. He had known she would ask eventually because Ada Voss did not leave important things unnamed. She understood, and he had come to understand that she understood, that things named are things you can work with. Things unnamed have a way of working on you instead. The old heat came up in him. The shame that had lived in his chest since the first of the 7 women, and that predated them by many years. The shame of being a particular way that the world had decided required apology. His instinct was to stand, to find a reason to be elsewhere, to perform the small vanishing act he had practiced since he was 15 years old, and first began to understand the full accounting of what he was going to cost the ordinary run of things. Her hand came to rest on his chest between the buttons of his flannel shirt. Not forceful, just present. It stopped him not because it could have stopped him physically, but because it asked something of his attention that overrode everything else. "Don't go," she said, low and direct. "You are the only person in recent memory who has stayed when staying was difficult. I am asking you to stay right now." So he stayed, and he told her. He told her in the flat, careful voice of someone who has rehearsed a thing so many times that the rehearsal has become the only available approach. The words came out level and measured and cost him something underneath, the level measured quality that he did not attempt to conceal. He told her what God had given him along with the height and the breadth of him. He told her what it had meant for the women who had understood and left. He told her he did not blame them, had never been able to blame them, because the thing was real and the fear was real, and he was the cause and the evidence and the consequence of both at once. And then he said the thing at the bottom of it, the thing he had never said to another person, in a voice that broke once and did not recover its full steadiness. In my whole life I have never been held, not once, not by anyone. And I made my peace with that a long time ago, or I believed I had. Ada lifted her head from his shoulder. She took his face in both her small hands, those precise hands that had in 4 months set bones, and cleaned his tools without being asked, and sat on a stone floor through a howling night so she could sleep against him. She turned his face toward her and waited until he looked at her. "Gideon Rowe," she said, "listen to me now, because I am going to tell you the truth and I need you to receive it." Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when steadiness is a choice being made in real time. "You were not made wrong. You were made large. Those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. And the only wrong in this entire story is that somewhere between your mother's death and today, the world convinced a good man to be ashamed of the body he was given." Her thumbs moved along his jaw. "There is nothing about you that frightens me," she said. "Do you hear me? Not one thing," he wept. "The real kind. The kind that has been held under pressure for so long that when the seal finally gives it takes everything with it, silent and shaking." And Ada pulled his head down against her shoulder and held it there, both arms reaching as far around him as they would reach, which was not all the way, and was entirely sufficient. Outside, the January wind moved across the high country, indifferent, clean. The fire burned in the stove, and Gideon Rowe, who had been alone on this ridge for 9 years and alone in a more fundamental sense for 30, was held for the first time in his life. February arrived with a brief false thaw that turned the south-facing slopes to mud, and then froze everything back to iron. May Briggs came up the mountain the second week of February. She had not done this in several years because of her knees and the state of the winter road. The fact that she was doing it now, rattling up the switchbacks in her old buckboard, with her breath-making clouds in the cold air, told Gideon something before she had said a word. May Briggs came to you when the news could not wait for you to come to her. She came into the kitchen without ceremony and pulled off her wool gloves and looked at the two of them, with the combined expression of a woman who has been watching a situation develop from a distance and has now arrived to confirm what she suspected. "Cole Fitch has been in Cold River since October," she said. "He took a room at the Silver Star the same week Ada arrived, and he has not left. He has been at my counter twice asking careful questions. Her name before, where she came from, whether she was likely to stay." May's mouth set into the particular line it made when she was controlling the urge to say considerably more than she was going to say. "I did not give him anything, but Cole Fitch is not in Cold River for his health, and he does not work alone." Ada's face went still. Not the professional stillness she deployed when a patient needed her to be the calmest person in the room. This was a different quality entirely. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for a particular piece of bad news, and has now received confirmation of its exact shape. "He works for Silas Drummond." "May, I don't know who he works for." "Ada, I do." She looked at Gideon, not for rescue, for the thing she looked to him for, which was not protection in the way anyone who did not know her would have assumed, but presence. The fact of him standing in the same room while she thought through what came next. "Silas has tried the legal route. He knows what my documents show. He knows a territorial court will not give him what he wants. A pause working through it, so he has been watching, learning the shape of what is here before he decides how to approach it differently." Gideon understood. He is not going to send a letter next time. No, Ada very still. He is going to send men, and he will not send them to argue law. May looked at Gideon with the expression she had been wearing at him since he was a young man eating solitary breakfasts in her corner. The expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing to become necessary and is watching it become necessary now. "The valley is different than it was in October," she said. "Pete Garfield's chest is clear for the first time in 7 years. Seth Dunbar has full use of that hand. Jim Stoker's wife came through a bad fever last month, and Jim has not stopped talking about it since." She paused. Ada belongs to this valley now. Whatever is coming up that road will find that out. Gideon looked at May, then he looked at Ada, the woman who had come up his mountain and not flinched and had in 4 months rebuilt without announcement or ceremony every assumption he had ever made about what his life was going to contain. They will find more than that, he said. May looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The nod of a person who has been waiting for a man to understand something and has just watched the understanding arrive. She pulled her wool gloves back on and stood from the table. The road will be good enough by March, she said. Whatever they're planning, they'll wait for the road. She paused at the door. Which means you have time to be ready, both of you. She looked at Ada. Those documents you mentioned, you have them here? I have had them here since October, Ada said. I brought them before I left. I knew this was coming. May looked at her for a moment with something that was very close to satisfaction. Good, she said, and she went out to her buckboard and drove back down the mountain in the February cold, leaving behind her a kitchen that was warmer than it had been before she arrived. Though not because of anything to do with the stove, that evening Gideon sharpened his axe. Not because the axe needed sharpening, because his hands needed something definite while he thought, and the long, slow strokes of the file on the blade were definite enough to give his thinking the stillness it needed. He sat in the barn in the cold and worked the edge and thought about the spring that was coming, and about the men who would come with it, and about the fact that he had spent 39 years being ashamed of what he was built from. He thought about the size of his hands on the file, the way they looked in the lamplight. The hands that had done nothing but care for things for 39 years, and that the world had decided to fear before they had done anything at all. He thought about what his mother had told him, about the reason for those hands, and about how long it had taken him to understand that she had been right and that he had been solving for the wrong problem. He was not built for apology. He understood that now with the specificity of a man who has just had a long confusion resolved. He had been built for exactly one thing. The thing his mother had tried to tell him, and the thing was this: to stand between the people he loved and the hard face of the world, not to overwhelm, not to threaten, to simply be between. Whatever came up that road in March would find him there. He put the axe down and felt the weight of it, and then set it carefully in its place on the wall, and went back to the house, where the lamp was burning in Ada's window, and the consulting room door was open, and she was writing in the leather notebook by the light of her desk lamp, making notes in her careful, precise hand, preparing in her own way for what was coming. He hung his canvas coat at the door. He poured water into the basin and washed his hands. He went to the carving room and sat down with the owl, which was finished, and looked at it for a long time. Then he started something new, a smaller piece, a pair of hands open and upward, carved from a single piece of pine. He did not know yet what they meant. He knew they needed to exist. He worked until the lamp burned low, and when Ada came out of the consulting room and stopped in the doorway and saw what he was carving, she looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at him. "What are those?" He considered the question. "I am not certain yet," he said, "but I think they are something I have been trying to understand how to make for a long time." She looked at his hands holding the work, and then at his face, and then back at the carving, and she said nothing else, and went to bed, and the lamp burned down to nothing. And outside, the February stars over Wyoming were very cold and very many, and the mountain was quiet all the way to the ridgeline. Whatever was coming could come. They were ready. March came to Stone Ridge the way March comes to the high country, not as a promise but as a negotiation. 2 days of warmth that turned the south-facing slopes to mud, followed by a night that froze everything back to iron and required starting over. The road down to Cold River was passable on some mornings, and a lie on others, and Gideon read it every dawn from the porch with the practiced eye of a man who knew what the evidence was telling him, and did not argue with it. He was on the porch the morning he saw the 3 riders. They came from the east, not from Cold River, not from the direction of any spread he knew, and they came at the pace of men who had been given an address and were following it rather than people who knew the country. Their horses were too well kept for working animals. That was the first thing. The second was the way they spread across the width of the switchback road as they climbed, not riding together the way neighbors ride but fanning out, taking up space the way men do when they have been told to leave nowhere to run. Gideon watched them from the porch without moving, canvas duster on, hat on, hands empty, and kept that way. He had been splitting wood before dawn, and the axe was beside the chopping block 30 feet to his left, and he did not go to it, not because he had decided against it. Because needing a thing and reaching for it were two different decisions, and he had learned years ago to keep them separate. He heard Ada in the kitchen, the particular sound of her mourning, the stove iron shifting, the weight of her step on the kitchen boards. Sounds he had learned across 5 months of early mornings without meaning to. He calculated what she could hear from inside, and what she could not, and what the next 4 minutes were likely to require. The riders came into the yard and stopped. The one in the center was in his mid-50s, wearing a vest that had been good quality when purchased and had not been replaced since, with the settled face of a man accustomed to people rearranging themselves around him before he had spoken a word. The two flanking him were younger and thicker through the shoulders, with the blank expression of men being paid to be present, rather than to think. One had his right hand resting near his holster in the studied casual way of someone who had rehearsed looking casual in precisely that posture. The center man looked at the house first, taking inventory. Then he looked at Gideon, with the measurement of someone who had been given a description, and was comparing it to the reality, and finding the reality considerably larger than anything the description had prepared him for. Looking for a woman goes by Voss. Staying up here? Gideon looked at him for a moment. This is private land, state your business or state your direction. The man adjusted in his saddle. This was not the response he had scripted for, and the minor displacement of his expectation showed briefly in his face before the authority settled back into place. Silas Drummond has a claim against Ada Drummond, formerly Voss. Legal matter. We're here to deliver a notice and discuss settlement of that claim. Ada came out the front door. She had heard it from inside. She came out with her wool coat already buttoned and the wooden instrument case not in her hands, which told Gideon she had taken a moment to secure it before stepping out, which told him she had understood the nature of the visit from inside the house. She stood beside him on the porch and looked at the three riders with the expression she used for situations requiring precision rather than emotion. "My name is Ada Voss," she said. "The other name is not mine and has not been mine for 2 years." The center man looked at her. Then he looked back at Gideon, recalibrating in the way people recalibrated around Gideon when the full reality of him had not been fully anticipated, and he did not do it gracefully, which told Gideon something about the kind of man he was, a man who did not like being in a position that required adjustment. Mr. Drummond's legal position is that debts incurred during a marriage are joint liability, regardless of whose name appears on the documents. He's prepared to discuss a settlement that keeps this matter out of the territorial courts. Ada was quiet for precisely long enough to let him finish. Then the documents you're describing were signed by Preston Dole alone, under his own name, at financial institutions in Wyoming territory that have records of those transactions and of who signed them. I have copies of those records, obtained directly from those institutions before I left. A pause. Not for effect, for accuracy. Silas Drummond has been informed of this. He chose to send you anyway. The man's jaw moved slightly. He had not been told that part. Furthermore, if Mr. Drummond intends to pursue a legal claim in Wyoming territory, he will need to do so through the territorial courts, which means he will need to be present in this territory, which means he will need to make his case before a judge with the evidence he actually has, which is his brother's signature on documents I did not sign. Another pause. I would like to see him make that case. Silence in the yard. The second rider, the one with his hand near his holster, had moved his hand away from his holster, not by decision, just the way hands move away from things when the situation they were positioned for does not develop in the expected direction. And then the center man looked past Ada entirely, to the vast quiet presence standing one step behind her left shoulder, and something crossed his face that Gideon had seen before. The calculation of the gap between what a person had imagined they were riding into and what they were actually standing in front of. Gideon had not spoken, had not moved, was simply there, and the being there was doing its own work the way weather does its work without requiring announcement. "You'd be Rowe," the center man said. "I would." Another silence. The center man glanced at his two companions with the brief sideways look of a person confirming that everyone present is sharing the same experience. Both of them were doing arithmetic about a problem they had not been briefed to expect, and neither of them was arriving at a comfortable answer. "Mr. Drummond's office stands ready to discuss terms," the center man said, but the iron had gone out of his voice. replaced by the flatness of a person saying the required thing, because leaving without saying it would feel too much like retreat. Gideon stepped down off the porch. One step, that was all. He did not close the distance between himself and the horses. He did not need to. The step itself was sufficient, and the nearest horse felt it before its rider did, shifting hard to the right with its ears back, the animal nervous system responding to what the human nervous system was still working to process. "The woman beside me is Ada Voss," Gideon said, and his voice came from somewhere that had been building pressure since February, since the night May Briggs had driven up the switchbacks with news that changed the shape of what was coming. "She will be Ada Rowe before this spring is out, and there is no claim that Silas Drummond can construct, legal or otherwise, that I will not answer for personally. He let that settle. Tell him that, and tell him that the next men he sends up this road should come prepared for a different kind of conversation than the one they are having now." The rider brought his horse back under control with an effort that cost him what composure he had remaining. The center man looked at Gideon for a long moment with the expression of a man who has received information that requires revising a plan he considered finished. "We'll relay the message," he said. They turned their horses and went back down the switchback road at a pace that was not quite a retreat, but was considerably more hurried than their arrival. Gideon stood in the yard and watched them go, until the sound of hooves had faded into the general silence of the mountain morning, and the pines had swallowed the last sight of them. He did not move immediately after that, because there was something in the yard that needed a moment before anyone spoke. The specific weight of what had just happened settling into the ground, like water finding its level. 5 months of waiting for this. 5 months of Ada sleeping in a room with a locked door, and building a practice out of nothing, and learning which way the deer moved before a storm. 5 months of preparing without preparation being the thing that showed on either of their faces. And now 3 men had ridden up and ridden back down, and the shape of what remained was different from the shape of anything that had come before it. Ada stood beside him, arms folded against the March cold, eyes on the empty road where the riders had disappeared into the trees below. "You said before spring is out," she said. "I did." The pines moved in the light wind off the peaks. A jay called once from somewhere in the tree line and went quiet. "Were you asking or telling?" Her voice was perfectly even, and with Ada perfectly even was not the absence of feeling but the proof of it, the sound of a woman paying very careful attention to the answer she was about to receive. Gideon Rowe turned to look at her, the woman who had come up his mountain and not flinched, who had cleaned his rusting tools without being asked and read to him by lamplight, and sat on a cold stone floor all night so she could sleep against his shoulder, who had taken his face in her hands in January and said the thing no one had ever said to him and meant it all the way down, who had made his terrible solitary silence into something a person could actually live inside, by the simple act of inhabiting it, without requiring it to be different. He went to one knee in the mud of the March yard. It brought his face close to level with hers. He took her hands in both of his, her small hands chapped at the knuckles and steady as they always were when steadiness was required, and he held them with all the care that 39 years of choosing gentleness had made second nature. "Ada Voss," he said, and his voice had the roughness of something that had waited a long time to be used for exactly this purpose. "I have nothing to give you that the world considers valuable. I am too large and too strange, and I have been alone long enough that I have probably forgotten things about being with another person that I will have to relearn from the beginning." He held her gaze. "But every single day since you stepped off that train has been the first day of my life that I did not want to end, and I would spend every day that is left to me making certain that you never spend another one afraid." The mountain was quiet around them. Pine and granite and the pale March sky. "Marry me. Not to settle anything. Not because of an arrangement, and not because 3 men just rode down that hill and I needed to say something true. Marry me because I love you in a way that has stopped making sense to me as a thing separate from breathing, and because I believe, God help me, that you might love me back." Ada looked at him kneeling in the mud in front of her. This enormous man who had built a lock for her door before he knew whether she would ever trust him, who had built fires for her mornings and carved a frost flower from white pine, and left it on her windowsill without saying a word about it. And her face did something it had never done in all the months he had known her. It came entirely apart. "You absolute fool," she said, And she was laughing and not quite crying, but made of the same material as crying. Both at once, the way the high country sometimes does two things with its weather simultaneously. I have loved you since the second week. Since I heard you singing to your horse through the barn wall, when you thought no one could hear. She pulled her hands free of his and cupped his face in them and tipped it up toward her. You have the worst singing voice I have ever encountered in my professional life, in my personal life, in any life I am aware of. He laughed, the real kind, starting in his chest rather than at the surface. Ada. Yes, she said. Yes, 1,000 times yes, you enormous, ridiculous man. He stood and she was on her toes, and he kissed her in the mud of the March yard with the mountain around them, and the pines and the pale sky, and not one other living soul within sight. And it was nothing like the thing he had feared for 39 years, and everything like the thing he had quietly stopped believing was possible. Gentle, real, sufficient. May Briggs received the news that same afternoon, delivered directly to her dining room. Because Ada said telling May first was a matter of community hygiene, and her response was to stand up from behind her counter and look at both of them, with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for a long time and is now watching the evidence arrive. Finally, she said. She sat back down and poured herself coffee. Saturday after next. The church. I will speak to Reverend Ames this afternoon. Do not argue with me about the date. I have been planning this longer than either of you have known each other. Ada looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at May, who was already making a list. We weren't going to argue, Ada said. Good. May did not look up from the list, and I am baking the cake. It will be large because the groom is large and proportions matter. Silas Drummond arrived in Cold River 3 days before the wedding. Flinched had left the Silver Star Hotel 4 days before Silas arrived. His room had been paid through the end of February, and then it was not, and no one in Cold River saw him go. But the morning before he left, he made one final attempt. He appeared at the hardware store counter, where Frank Dunbar was pricing fence wire, and asked, in the comfortable manner of a man curious about nothing in particular, whether the Rowe property on Stone Ridge carried any outstanding liens against it. Frank Dunbar set down the wire and looked at him. May Briggs happened to be in the hardware store. She had come for a length of stove rope, and had not yet left, and she came around the corner from the dry goods aisle with the rope in her hand, and the expression of a woman who has reached the end of a patience that was not unlimited to begin with. Flinched, she said. Her voice did not rise, it never needed to. You have been drinking my coffee and asking careful questions in this town since October, and I have let it go, because watching a man reveal himself through his own behavior is more efficient than confronting him before he is finished. But we are done with that now. Fitch opened his mouth. May did not stop. This town knows what Ada Voss has done for this valley. Pete Garfield is making plans for the first time in 7 years because of her hands. Seth Dunbar is working cattle with both hands because of her. There is not a family within 15 miles that does not owe her something real and knows it. She looked at him with the complete calm of a woman who has nothing to prove and nowhere to be. So I would like you to think carefully about what you believe you can accomplish here, and then I would like you to get on your horse. Frank Dunbar had set the fence wire down and was standing with his arms crossed. Pete Garfield had come in behind Fitch at some point during the exchange and was standing in the doorway, filling most of it, with the stillness of a man who has arrived at exactly the right moment and has no intention of being anywhere else. The two men at the counter who had been eating their midday meal had stopped eating and were watching with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be described accurately for many years. Fitch looked at May, then at Frank, then at Pete in the doorway. Then he picked up his hat from the counter and walked out. He was seen riding south out of Cold River before the noon meal was finished. No one followed him. The town had made its position clear in the way towns make things clear, when they have decided to act as one thing rather than many. May watched him go from the hardware store window. Then she went back to the dry goods aisle for her stove rope. Silas Drummond came 3 days later on a good horse in a good wool coat and took a room at the Silver Star, and that afternoon sent a message to Stone Ridge by way of the hotel boy, addressed to Ada, asking her to come down at her convenience to discuss the matter of the estate. Ada read the message standing in the doorway of the consulting room. She folded it along its original creases and set it on the side table. I'll go tomorrow morning, she said. I'll ride with you, I know. She looked up at him. You'll stay outside. He opened his mouth and she held his gaze with the gray eyes that did not negotiate on the things that mattered and that had the ability, despite every physical fact to the contrary, to make him feel she was looking at him level. This is mine to finish. Not because I don't want you there. Because Preston Dole made decisions on my behalf for 2 years without my permission, and Silas Drummond has been doing the same for 2 years after that. And the only way this ends is if I end it in my own name and my own words and my own evidence. Pause. You being outside is the same as you being in the room. You know that. He did know it. He did not like it, and he knew it. But both things were true, and neither one cancelled the other. She was up before him the next morning. He found her at the consulting room desk with the document box open in front of her. The papers, organized in the order she intended to present them. Her medical notebook open beside the box to a page she had written the night before. The desk lamp was burning low. She had been there a long time. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her and did not say anything because the thing to say was not a thing that needed saying, and they had both known it for months. After a while she looked up. If I seem calm, she said, it is because I have been preparing for this conversation for 2 years. Not because I am calm. She looked at her hands flat on the table. I know my hands are not going to shake. They never do when it matters. They shake after. That is when I know it is over. He rode down with her and she went into the Silver Star, and he stopped his horse at the edge of the main street and dismounted and stood with the reins in his hand and the March wind in his canvas duster and waited. He was aware of being observed. Cold River had the quality of a place where public events were attended to from windows and doorways, and the arrival of Ada Voss and Gideon Rowe in the middle of the main street on a Wednesday morning was the kind of event that warranted attendance. He saw movement in May's window. He saw Frank Dunbar on the hardware store porch with the stillness of a man who had decided not to pretend he was there for any other reason. He stood with his horse and waited. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. He counted it the way you count difficult things, not by looking at a watch but by the accumulation of smaller intervals. Horses passing, the changing angle of the March light, the slow movement of May Briggs from her window to her doorway to a position on her porch, from which she could see both the hotel entrance and Gideon simultaneously, which told him May had decided to be a witness whether anyone had asked her to or not. Ada came out the front door of the Silver Star and walked across the street toward him with her instrument case under her arm and her wool coat buttoned straight and her step even and unhurried and her face doing nothing at all. The absolute professional neutrality that meant she was holding something very tightly behind it. She stopped in front of him and looked up. It's done, she said. He watched her face, watched her look briefly at some point above and behind his left shoulder. The way people look when they are placing something on a shelf inside themselves, where it will no longer require active holding. He is a man who needs the appearance of winning even when he concedes, she said. So I said several things after he conceded, none of which changed the substance. He will not pursue a claim in the territorial courts because he knows the documents end the claim before it begins. Something moved briefly in her jaw. He is the kind of man who cannot leave a room without making certain everyone in it remembers he was there. I have met men like that before. I have learned that what they leave behind is theirs to carry, not mine. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her hands. You said your hands shake after. She looked down at them. Still, perfectly still, yes. She looked back up at him. They'll start when I get back on the horse. He took both her hands in his and held them. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already say better. And they stood in the middle of the main street of Cold River with Frank Dunbar on the hardware porch and May Briggs on her dining room steps and the cold March wind coming steadily down off the Laramie peaks. After a moment he felt her hands move, a fine trembling. 2 years of pressure finding the smallest available exit. There it is, she said quietly. There it is, he agreed. Frank Dunbar walked across the street. He stopped at a respectful distance with his hat in his hands. Heard there was some trouble with outside men coming around, he said. He looked at Ada. Seth says that hand works straight as the day before the nail. We're obliged to you. He paused. If anything needs doing before Saturday, any of us can help. You only have to say the word. Thank you, Frank, Ada said. He put his hat back on and went back to his porch. And Gideon looked at the street and thought about what had changed in this valley since October. The invisible accumulation of trust Ada had built, one properly set bone and one broken fever at a time, one rancher's wife and one rattling chest at a time, until the valley had arranged itself around her, the way water arranges itself around a new stone, finding its level, determining its new course. Silas Drummond had sent Cole Fitch to learn the shape of what was on Stone Ridge before deciding how to approach it. What Fitch had learned and reported back had not contained the most important thing. The valley was not simply the backdrop for Gideon Rowe's solitary life anymore. It was the community of Ada Voss. Those were two different things with two different weights, and today Silas Drummond had discovered the difference between them the hard way. Saturday arrived the way the best things arrive. Earlier than felt possible and exactly on time. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming clarity that only comes after winter has spent all its weather. Sky so blue it looked like something deliberate. Air with an edge to it that made everything sharp and close and real. Gideon had not slept well, not from the old preemptive bracing for loss that had characterized every previous occasion of this kind. From the sleeplessness of a man about to receive something he has spent 30 years being told he would not receive, whose nerves have not yet been persuaded that the morning will arrive and confirm the 30 years were wrong. The morning came anyway. He dressed in the suit May had commissioned from Ruth Hendress, who had spent 3 evenings and most of 2 bolts of good black wool, producing something that fit Gideon Rowe the way no store-bought garment ever had. White shirt with a stiff collar, black cravat, the boots he had blacked the night before. He stood before the small mirror in his room, which showed him from the collarbone up, because no mirror in this house had been built for a man his height, and he looked at his own face with the attention of a man trying to determine whether the person looking back is ready for what the day requires. He thought the person looking back might be. Cold River's church had a tin roof and pine pews and plain glass windows that let in the March light without decoration. It held perhaps 90 people in the ordinary way. This was not the ordinary way. They were in the street. That was the thing he was not prepared for, coming around the last bend in the road to find the church with people not just inside it but on the porch and down the steps and spilling out onto the main street. Men in their good wool coats and women in their Sunday dresses and heavy cloaks. Every face he knew from the valley and some he did not. People who had ridden in from spreads 15 miles out because the word had traveled and had found people who understood, without being able to say exactly why, that this particular event required their presence. He sat on his horse at the edge of the street and did not trust his face for a moment. Seth Dunbar in the second row with his brother, the repaired hand resting easy on his knee. Pete Garfield with his wife, the two of them sitting close the way people sit when a hard season has reminded them what they have. May Briggs in the front pew with a handkerchief already in her hand. Frank Dunbar on the men's side with his hat in his lap and the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important for a long time and is sitting in the correction of it and finding the correction good. Gideon dismounted and went inside. He stood at the front of the church and looked at all these people and understood something that had been available to him as an idea for months, but was only now arriving as something he knew in his bones. That what Ada had done on this mountain had not been only to him, that she had walked through this valley without fear and used his name the way she used any name, ordinarily, without the weight the valley had always attached to it, until the valley began to hear how it was supposed to sound. And in doing that she had changed not just what they thought of him, but what they thought they were capable of. The people who had gotten it wrong for 30 years, and were now being given the chance to get something right. Then she appeared at the end of the aisle. The dress was the color of a Wyoming sky in the hour before, true blue, pale and clear and entirely her own choice. She carried the dried wildflowers from October, the yellow and purple ones he had put in the blue glass bottle in her room, before he knew her, which she had pressed and kept in the back of her medical text, since the week she arrived without ever mentioning it to him. She walked without being accompanied down the length of the aisle because that was who Shanta was. A woman who had been walking alone through difficult country for a long time and did not require a ceremony of being delivered to a destination she had chosen herself. She looked at him the entire length of the aisle. No performance in it, just the direct gray attention of a person who knows exactly where she is going and has already decided she is glad. Reverend Ames was a man of 60 who had performed many ceremonies in this valley and had learned to read what each one needed from him. He read this one correctly and kept his own words brief and gave the occasion back to the people who were making it. Ada went first. Her voice was clear in the hush of the church, carrying to the back rows and out the open door to the people on the steps. Gideon, I came to Wyoming as a woman who had learned to verify everything before she trusted it. I have verified you thoroughly. Something that was almost a smile held itself back for the weight of the moment. I have verified you in blizzards and in the ordinary days between them. I have verified you in the dark at 2 a.m. and in a yard, where 3 men came to take something from me and you stood at my back like a man who had finally found the use he was made for. She held his gaze. I vow to see you clearly every day for the rest of my life. Not the story this valley told about you. Not the size of you before the substance of you. The man who installed a lock on my door before he knew whether I would ever open it from the inside. The man who built fires for my mornings without once asking to be thanked for it. Her voice changed. The clinical steadiness giving way to something that had been underneath it all along, waiting for a moment worth rising to. I vow that you will never have to make yourself smaller than you are. Not for me, not for anyone who comes after. I love the full dimensions of you, Gideon Rowe, every board and beam of you, and I am proud beyond what I know how to say to be your wife. May Briggs was weeping audibly in the front pew. She was not alone. Gideon's voice when he found it was rougher than he had intended, and he let it be rough because the day required honesty and rough was honest. I stood on that train platform 8 times, he said, and watched hope walk down the steps and walk away again. I learned to lose so well that I stopped knowing the difference between preparing to lose and simply expecting to, and after a while there was no difference. And then you stepped off that train and looked at all of me. He stopped, pressed on, and the only thing on your face was relief. Another pause, shorter. I vow to hold you carefully every day I am given, to put everything I was built from, every pound and every inch of what this world decided was too much, between you and every hard thing it can produce. I vow that you will always have somewhere to put your weight down. His voice dropped to the register he used for things that mattered most. You asked once whether I was asking or telling. Today I am telling. You are the first place I have ever wanted to come back to. You are home. You will be home for every day that I have left to come back from. Reverend Ames said the words. Gideon lifted Ada from the floor of the church, both hands careful at her waist, and kissed her while Cold River rose to its feet. Not polite applause. A sound that began in 300 chests at once and had nowhere to go but out. The sound of a thing that had been wrong for a very long time becoming right in a single moment. It went out the open door, and down the steps and into the street and up the mountain road, and probably reached the ridge itself, carried on the March wind. May Briggs was on her feet in the front pew with both arms raised. Gideon held Ada with her feet off the ground, and her arms around his neck, and he lifted his head and laughed. The kind that had been building since October and had found its moment. Unguarded and enormous and entirely free. The kind of laugh that had been waiting since before his mother died and before he understood what he was. It rolled down the street and off the storefronts, and the people nearest him stepped back not from fear, but from the sheer physical fact of joy at that volume, and then they cheered louder than before. Frank Dunbar climbed onto a hay wagon near the end of the afternoon, wine in hand, and hollered that any man who wanted to start trouble in the valley now had to reckon with that first, pointing at Gideon, and the crowd's response sent the sparrows from the cottonwood in a rising black cloud. May pulled Frank down by his vest, but she was laughing while she did it, and she did not try very hard. The feast happened in the street because no building in Cold River could have held it. Tables carried out from May's dining room, and from the hotel, and from the homes of people who had hauled them 3 blocks in their Sunday coats, without complaint. May's cake occupied the center of the largest table, 5 tiers with a lean to the left that gave it a kind of honesty, and it fed every person present with enough remaining to send people home with wrapped pieces. There was a fiddle and a guitar and dancing on the packed earth of the main street in the March afternoon sun, and the music went until the stars came out. When Gideon took Ada's hand and led her out to dance, the crowd fell back to give them room and then went quiet to watch. This man moving with the deliberate, careful grace of someone who had always known precisely what his size could do to things and had spent a lifetime choosing otherwise. Turning his small silver-haired wife in the afternoon light, under the budding cottonwood at the edge of the street, slowly, like something that did not need to hurry because it was not going anywhere. She laughed. Not the measured laugh she used in rooms where she was working. The full unguarded kind carrying in the clear air, He looked down at her and felt something in his chest release that he had not known was still held, some last remnant of the braced for loss that had lived in him so long it had begun to feel like a permanent resident, and he threw his head back and let the laugh out of him. The one that had been waiting since before his mother died, and before the world gave him the full accounting of what he was going to cost it. It went down the street, and the whole of Cold River heard it and understood what they were hearing. A man who had finally stopped apologizing for the ground he stood on. The stars were out by the time the last guests made their way home. May retired to her dining room, with the expression of a woman who has done something of significance and intends to rest in the knowledge of it. Gideon and Ada rode up to Stone Ridge in the dark, the horses finding the road by memory, the moonlight on the snow of the peaks the only light they needed. They did not talk much on the way up. The day had used language thoroughly, and what was left between them needed no translation. The house was cold when they arrived, the fire gone out while they were away, and Gideon built it back the way he always did, methodical, patient, starting small and letting it grow. Ada sat in the chair beside the stove and watched him work, and the silence between them was the easiest silence that had ever existed in that house. Later, in the room he had built for a man who expected to remain alone in it, the ghosts that had stood in the dark corners for 30 years quietly left, not all at once, one by one, displaced not by anything dramatic, but by the simple accumulated weight of a woman who was not afraid and had never been afraid, and whose heart, when he put his hand against it, beat with the steadiness of something that had made up its mind. She pressed his hand flat against her chest and held it there, and he felt her heart beneath his palm, steady and unhurried, the heart of a woman who had made up her mind a long time ago and had not changed it since. He lay in the dark and listened to it and understood for the first time in his life that the body he had been given was not the obstacle he had spent 39 years navigating around. It was the instrument, not the limitation, the very thing. The following autumn, when the aspens went gold on the lower slopes and the air carried the cold, clean edge that came with the year turning, Ada stood on the porch of Stone Ridge with one hand resting on the swell of her belly, watching Gideon come up from the lower pasture with his horse walking easy beside him, and the last of the day's light catching the peaks above. He saw her, and the smile came across his face the way light comes across open ground, nothing blocking it, nothing held back. He crossed the yard and went to one knee in front of her, unhurried, the way a man does a thing that has become as natural to him as breathing. And he laid his hand beside hers on the curve of her belly, and was quiet for a moment. Just the mountain around them, and the sound of the wind in the pines below, and the evening coming on. Your mother, he said quietly, speaking to the child who was not yet in the world, rode a train for 4 days and came up a mountain in the rain, and looked at everything she found here, and was not afraid. Not once. Not for a single moment. He looked up at Ada, her hand in his hair, the evening light making the silver at her temples bright as frost. And she taught me the thing I am going to spend the rest of my life teaching you. What thing is that? Her voice was soft, the voice she used when there was no performance required from either of them. That being made different is not the same as being made wrong, he said. That the size of a person tells you nothing about the size of what they carry inside them. And that the bravest thing, the very bravest thing in this whole world, is to let yourself be loved. Ada looked down at the man kneeling in the yard at her feet, the man the valley had called a devil for 30 years and had spent the last year learning to call neighbor, and she said simply, with the precision she brought to things that mattered, "We'll teach it together," and they did, in the tall warm house on the ridge, in all the long good years that followed, with the whole of the Laramie Range above them, and the town of Cold River below slowly, over time and generations, forgetting there had ever been a reason to be afraid. They did not call him the devil anymore. Not after a while. Not after enough time had passed that the name required explanation, and the explanation always ended the same way, with whoever was listening understanding that the story was not about a devil at all. It was about a mountain and the woman who climbed it. And what she found at the top was not what they had said was there. It was a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone willing to see him right, and a life that had been waiting, patient as stone, for someone willing to live it.